ahora con la conferencia de la profesora, de la doctora Sheryl Reiss, que no ha podido venir hasta aquí, pero su conferencia será retransmitida a través de una grabación que hemos realizado por Zoom. Ella es doctora en Historia del Arte y investigadora residente en la Newberry Library de Chicago y además profesora en esta universidad. Y nos va a hablar de las corrientes historiográficas vinculadas a patronazgo femenino en la Edad Moderna, especialmente focalizado al tema italiano, pero también con perspectiva más amplia en otros territorios europeos. Le damos paso. Muchas gracias.
Very much, Noela, for that lovely introduction. I'm going to start my screen here, and I would like to also stop my video. All right. I'd like to begin by thanking Noelia Garcia Perez for inviting me to participate in this symposium and for the assistance of Paloma Malaga Shaw, Paz Castillo, and especially Emma Luisa Cahill Marone with many practical details. I'm also grateful to Javier Onaldo and Miguel Falomir of the Prado. I deeply regret that I've not been able to travel to Madrid to participate in person in this singularly important event. I should also add at the outset that due to time constraints and the challenges of obtaining research materials during the COVID pandemic, my remarks are mostly limited to publications in English that I have been able to consult. I will inevitably have left out important scholarship, including websites, for which I apologize. For more than 3,000 years, patronage of art and architecture has provided a noteworthy path for women's agency and self-fashioning. The English term patron is derived from the Latin patronus, protector of clients or dependents, specifically freedmen, which in turn comes from pater, father. Thus, the term patronage is inherently gendered, and in nearly all cases, female patrons worked within the limitations of patriarchal societies. Yet, from antiquity to the present, women have requested and collected works of art and have commissioned buildings and urban interventions. It is important to stress that the patronage systems of the past were based on social stratification and inequalities in power and economic standing. So, in general, patronage by both women and men was primarily the province of elites who had the means to extend commissions. Some art historians have used the neologism matronage when discussing women patrons. But along with many working on the topic today, I prefer to use the traditional, albeit gendered term patronage. The dramatic expansion of scholarly interest in female patrons in the medieval and early modern periods is part of the greater project to recover evidence for women's agency in the past. While this conference is dedicated to the patronage and collecting activities of a number of remarkable Spanish and Habsburg royal women, including Isabel of Castile, Juana of Austria, and Isabel Clara Eugenia, I would like to reflect on the historiography of the study of women patrons and collectors in the area of my own expertise, early modern Italy, and to suggest directions for ongoing research. Here we go. Crucial to understanding female patronage of art is the study of female role models and networks that bound these women, as they were often connected in one way or another through bonds of kinship, marriage, and community. In his 2007, The Art of the Network, Strategic Interactions and Patronage in Renaissance Florence, sociologist Paul D. MacLean wrote, and I quote, "To understand how culture works in interaction and to see the faces of networking, a study of patronage-related interaction in Renaissance Florence is especially apt. Networking, particularly in the form of patronage, was essential to the development of Renaissance art and to the process of social climbing and the operations of the Renaissance church, the Renaissance state, and the Renaissance economy. Female patrons and collectors in early modern Italy, the focus of my talk this morning, and in Europe more widely, can be categorized in several ways. These taxonomies include women's ages from adolescence to old age, their socioeconomic status, whether rulers, consorts, nobility, are members of the magnate or merchant classes, and occasionally non-elite women. Marital status, including never wed, married, or widowed, along with mistresses and courtesans, and whether they were secular women or female religious, as in the nun patrons of these two altarpieces. Sometimes these classifications overlap, as in the cases of nuns who were also noblewomen, a good example being the strong-willed Benedictine abbess Giovanna da Piacenza, patron of Correggia's magnificent Camera di San Paolo in Parma around 1519, and of wealthy widows who retreated to convents as lay sisters later in life. Significant work on nuns and other women associated with convents as patrons and viewers of art include Marilyn Dunn's seminal art bulletin articles, the first of 1988, titled Nuns as Patrons, the Decoration of Santa Marta al Collegio Romano, and Piety and Patronage in Seicento, Rome, Two Noblewomen and the Convents of 1994, along with numerous other studies, including recent essays on Counter-Reformation and Baroque nuns in 2012 and 2015. Other fundamental work includes Geraldine Wood's Women, Art, and Spirituality, The Poor Clares of Early Modern Italy, published in 1996, Annabelle Thomas's Art and Piety in the Female Religious Communities of Renaissance Italy, published in 2008, Anne Roberts' Dominican Women and Renaissance Art, the Convent of San Domenico of Pisa of that same year. More recently published work in this area includes Giancarlo Peritti's In the Courts of Religious Ladies, Art, Vision, and Pleasure in Italian Renaissance Convents of 2016, which also looks at the overlapping categories of nun and noblewoman, and Kathleen Arthur's Art and Observant Franciscan Piety, Caterina Vigri, and the Poor Clares of Early Modern Ferrara, published in 2018. Questions to bear in mind when examining women's art patronage include, inter alia, who were the female patrons in Italy and elsewhere from the 14th through 18th centuries? What were their relationships with other women and with men, including their kinsmen and the artists and architects whose works they commissioned and collected? To what social classes do these women belong? And how were they able to finance the undertakings that they sponsored? What types of work did they request? What were the personal, familial, and societal motivations for their patronage? What were the social, political, and religious groups and networks to which these women patrons belonged? Did the character of patronage by women differ from that of men? And what were the mechanisms of their patronage in a male-dominated culture? These are some of the questions posed in the prologue to the collection of essays I co-edited with David G. Wilkins, entitled Beyond Isabella, Secular Women Patrons of Art in Renaissance Italy, that was published in 2001, after a long genesis that began with a conference panel in 1993. In the 2 decades since the publication of the book, an extraordinary body of work has been published on women patrons, and today I would like to think about the development of this vibrant field of inquiry. My paper this morning is divided into 4 sections. First, I would like to highlight some of the fundamental work on women patrons and collectors through 2001. I will then briefly consider some of the major themes and conclusions of Beyond Isabella. Next, I will survey more recent work over the past 2 decades, concentrating primarily on secular women patrons in early modern Italy. Significantly, while recognizing local, regional, and national differences, many patterns of women's patronage seen in Italy also pertained elsewhere in Europe, especially in Catholic Europe. And finally, I will consider future directions for research and briefly mention their impact on my own work. In a book review article of 1995, titled The Progress of Patronage in Renaissance Italy, the historian Kate Lowe encouraged a re-examination of the assumption that Isabella d'Este, Marchesa of Mantua, was a nearly unique example of female art patron in the Renaissance, noting, and I quote, "It may be worthwhile to consider new directions in studies on patronage, which have not been represented by the books under review. Not one of them addresses directly the issue of female patronage. Generally, authors mouth platitudes on Isabella d'Este in lieu of giving serious attention to this utterly neglected field. A huge body of material is available for a consideration of the physiognomy of female patronage, and new studies of it would certainly add to our understanding of gender relations and the place of women in society, as well to our comprehension of the process. In part because of her widespread and often aggressive acquisition and patronage of art, both ancient and modern, such as this magnificent recent purchase of the Metropolitan Museum of Art at the right, attributed to her patronage or collecting, and in part because her activities are exceptionally well documented in letters, account books, and inventories, Isabella d'Este has been and remains the quintessential exemplar of female art patron and collector in Renaissance Italy. Isabella d'Este was unusually well educated for a woman of the period, and she was a demanding patron. Until relatively recently, Isabella had also been singled out as the great exception, a nearly unique example of a Renaissance woman as patron of art. So much outstanding work has been done on her that in 2013, I called it a cottage industry. But do let me mention the work of Clifford Brown, Egon Verheyen, Rosemary San Juan, Sylvia Farino Pagden, Molly Bourne, Stephen Campbell, Jonathan Katz-Nelson, and many others. I should also mention the publications of historian Sarah Cockram, musicologist Tim Shepard, and especially the literary scholar Diana Shemek, who has edited, translated, and interpreted selections of Isabella's letters. Nonetheless, 25 years before Lowe's remarks in 1995, so 1975, my most prescient co-editor, David Wilkins, seen here, had already remarked on the absence of studies of the roles women may have played as patrons of art in a brief article entitled Women as Patron, Artist and Patron in the Middle Ages and Renaissance. At that time, one of the very few scholars to have exhibited interest in a woman patron other than Isabella d'Este was Erwin Panofsky himself, who investigated the Benedictine abbess Giovanna da Piacenza in his 1961 study of Correggio's Camere di San Paolo. The apparent lack of scholarly interest in the art patronage of early modern women, especially secular women, changed slowly in the 1980s and early 1990s, with pioneering publications by authors including Alison Lux on Raphael's Perugian patrons, Sheila Folliot on the Italian-born Catherine de' Medici, Elena Ciletti on Anna Maria Luisa de' Medici, Gabriella Zari on Raphael's Bolognese patron, the Beata Elena Duglioli dall'Olio, Catherine Turrell on Girolamo da Carpi's Muzzarelli altarpiece, which prominently features its widowed patron, Mary Vaccaro on the contract for Parmigianino's Vision of St. Jerome, also painted for a widow, Maria Buffalini, Catherine King on lay women as patrons, and especially Carolyn Valloni, whose groundbreaking work, beginning in the 1990s, on the architectural patronage of Roman noblewomen in the Counter-Reformation era, has inspired many other scholars, as attested by the 2015 Festschrift in her honor, edited by Catherine McIver and Cynthia Stolhans, titled Patronage, Gender, and the Arts in Early Modern Italy. Most of these early studies dealt with women's patronage of religious art, like altarpieces and funerary chapels, and of religious institutions, with some work on women's patronage and of portraits and domestic objects beginning to appear. What Kate Lowe's remarks do not suggest is that by 1995, when her review essay appeared, there was already very considerable interest in the patronage of art by women in early modern Europe, but much of the research had yet to be published. By the time the session that Wilkins and I organized took place in May 1993, it was evident that many scholars had been gathering material on Renaissance women patrons, and the next few years would see a veritable flood tide of publications and dissertations completed. As Caroline Murphy noted in her 2003 review of Beyond Isabella, and I quote, "The 1990s were an exciting period for those concerned with gender issues in Italian Renaissance art. Seemingly overnight, a group of scholars emerged determined to track down how, when, where, and why women created, commissioned, and utilized works of art. Such scholarship provided access to a world in which Renaissance women were seen to have a greater measure of the autonomy history has traditionally denied them. It is worth noting that much of the research on women patrons in the 1990s and since has appeared in collections of essays, bringing together the research of multiple contributors, often using a case study approach. Although monographic studies are now much more common, and I would draw your attention to books like Stephanie Solem's 2015 study of Lucrezia Tornabuoni, Women, Patronage and Salvation in Renaissance Florence, Adelina Modesti's 2019 Women's Patronage and Gendered Cultural Networks in Early Modern Europe, Vittoria della Rovere, and Giuseppe Capriotti's Il tempo delle Fenice e degli Unicorni, published in 2020. As a rule, until recently, these books have not been lavishly illustrated in color, reflecting perhaps a bias on the part of some publishers against what had been seen as research of marginal interest. Indeed, just to share an anecdote, it is worth mentioning that in 1997, the manuscript for Beyond Isabella was rejected by a major university press based on the assessment of an anonymous reader who said that the subject of women's art patronage was, and I quote, inherently weak and not worthy of a book-length study, end quote. As the historiography of the ensuing 25 years and this gathering proved, and the slide provided to me by Sheila Folliot, the reviewer was greatly mistaken. And here I would like to single out the truly heroic efforts of Erica Gaffney as the commissioning editor, first at Ashgate and now at the Amsterdam University Press, for fostering the publication of so much work in this area. And Rutledge is now following in this path, as are other presses, including Penn State and Louisiana State. Among the fundamental studies published in the mid to late 1990s and the early years of the 21st century were a special number of Renaissance studies from 1996, edited by Janie Anderson, titled Women Patrons of Renaissance Art, 1300 to 1600, which was based on panels held at the 1994 meeting of the British Association of Art Historians. The collection brought together contributions by a number of scholars, including Murphy on Lavinia Fontana's Bolognese Patrons, and King on Margherita Pellegrini's chapel at San Bernardino in Verona. Anderson's introductory essay provides an overview of the topic, drawing attention to early writers on women patrons in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and stressing that hundreds of women patrons could be identified, many of them commissioning works of great quality. In 1997, a collection of essays edited by Cynthia Lawrence, based on a seminal 1990 conference at Temple University in Philadelphia, was published under the title Women and Art in Early Modern Europe: Patrons, Collectors, and Connoisseurs. This volume contained 12 essays on European female patrons and collectors from the 14th through 18th centuries. Some were queens, like the Italian-born Catherine de' Medici, considered by Sheila Folliot, and Marie de' Medici, subject of Geraldine Johnson's contribution. Some were about noble women, like Eleonora di Toledo in an article by Carolyn Smith, and Anna Maria Luisa de' Medici in an essay by Elena Ciletti. In the book's introduction, Lawrence emphasized themes in the book, including the status of women in early modern Europe, the types of commissions they extended, and the socioeconomic conditions necessary for patronage by women. Particularly suggestive are her remarks on the impact of female patrons on both iconography and style. In an essay on Renaissance art patronage in general, published in 1996, Tracy Cooper wrote about the talks presented in the 1990 Philadelphia conference. And I quote, "My last example purports to be a wholly new field of study, matronage. These women were, for the most part, members of the ruling elite, yet subordinate in a patriarchal gender system such as that of Renaissance Italy. In fact, the very conceit matronage focuses our awareness on this paradox, playing as it does on the inescapable patrilineal basis for the system of patronage." 1998 saw the publication of Catherine King's book, Renaissance Women Patrons, Wives and Widows in Italy, circa 1300 to 1500. The single-authored book, a rarity at the time, greatly expands on her 1992 article, seen earlier, Medieval and Renaissance Matrons, Italian Style, which described the patronage of lesser-known lay women, some of them significantly from classes beneath the aristocracy, primarily of religious art. In both, King vividly brought to life wealthy widows who commissioned objects that stressed their piety and agency. In the introduction to the volume, King singled out the extraordinary inscription seen here on the predella of a 1492 altarpiece by Niccolò Laluno that poses the question of authorship, and I quote, "To the reader, the prize Brigida, now dead, willed that this noble work be painted. Oh, a gift extremely pleasing to God. If you seek to know the artist's name, it is Niccolò Laluno of Foligno, beautiful crown of his native land. But who is more worthy of merit according to you? I ask you, my reader, since Brigida gave the commission and he the exacting hand." The topic of patronal authorship by men is one that has engaged scholars working on male patrons, but the topic is surely one that could be profitably explored by those studying women patrons. King's 1992 article downplays women's patronage of architecture, both ecclesiastic and secular, noting, and I quote, "Lay women, however rich, never commissioned palaces, presumably because they could not be represented as sexually powerful generators of dynasty." A considerable body of more recent work has, however, demonstrated that women were active architectural patrons in early modern Italy and elsewhere in Europe, a topic to which I will return. In 2000, a special number of the Italian journal Quaderni Storici was devoted to women's art patronage in Renaissance Italy, edited by Sarah Matthews Greco and Gabriella Zari, Comitenza Artistica Femminile, was based on conferences held in Florence in 1998 and 1999. None of the contributions to Beyond Isabella explored women's art patronage in Naples, Bologna, or Venice. So the essays in this publication, serve as a welcome complement. Bruce Edelstein's contribution looks at how the social environment in Naples formed the character of two major patrons, Eleanor of Aragon, seen on the cover, and Eleonora di Toledo. Murphy's essay continues her exploration of patronage by Cinquecento Bolognese women, in this case widows, while Sabina Bravaglieri's explores Tintoretto and female patrons at a Venetian consorority. Beyond Isabella, with its wonderful little lady on the cover, was published in the summer of 2001. Devoted exclusively to art patronage by secular women from the mid-14th through late 16th centuries, the volume's often overlapping themes included motivations for women's patronage of art, including piety, familial and dynastic concerns, and commemoration, themes explored by Carolyn Vallone, the late Benjamin Cole, Lawrence Jenkins, and other contributors, the dynamics of conjugal patronage addressed by Cole, Molly Bourne, and Edelstein, the importance of networks and role models considered by Vallone and McIver, and the singular importance of widows, who often had greater autonomy and access to funds as patrons of art and architecture, a topic explored by Vallone, Mary Vaccaro, Elizabeth Pilliard, and myself. Another topic is that of gendered spaces, discussed by Cole and briefly in my contribution to the volume. Significantly, Rosie Prieto Gilday addressed women patrons of non-elite classes, and Roger Crum and Marjorie Ock wrote about what has come to be called indirect patronage. That is to say, instances where the wishes, concerns, and desires of women are seen in the works of art they may have not paid for directly. Crum provocatively used the analogy of a future archaeologist discovering his father's checkbook filled with payments for embellishing the Crum house with paintings, furniture, drapes, and other precious items. While the archaeologist might assume that the senior Crumb was a great patron, Crumb wrote, and I quote, "The truth is that my mother chose the house and everything in it, and her will was supreme, if not exclusive. When renovations were made, a chair recovered, or a painting selected for purchase or removal. My father is far from being a 21st century patron. He just pays the bills." End quote. Well, some of our authors demonstrated how women used patronage to manipulate or subvert the male-dominated structures and institutions in which they operated. Others, myself included, my essay on Alfonsino Orsini de' Medici, seen here, emphasized how other women extended commissions in order to sustain and further the aims and motivations of their male relatives. This is a topic to which I have returned in a current project on Alfonsina's tomb in Rome, seen at the right, a rare example in Italy of a woman's tomb patronized by a daughter. In the past, some art historians have argued strenuously against an approach that considers women's agency within the broader sphere of gender relations. However one chooses to interpret such behavior, Beyond Isabella presented evidence for both oppositional and relational activities by women patrons. Indications that both models were at work suggest that greater flexibility is needed in our consideration of how women operated within the socially constructed gender boundaries of the early modern period. In the prologue to Beyond Isabella, David Wilkins and I wrote, and I quote, "It is our hope that this volume will encourage scholars to move yet further beyond Isabella in their assessment of women's patronage of art and architecture in Renaissance Italy, and in so doing, significantly broader our understanding of late medieval and early modern patronage patterns in general." It has been particularly gratifying to see that many of the questions we posed and the themes we identified have been explored by others working not only on Italian topics and in art history, but also in other periods and disciplines such as musicology and theater history. And here I am thinking, for example, of the work of Valeria De Luca, on the right. In the next segment of my talk, I will focus on work concerning secular women patrons in early modern Italy, published in the past 2 decades, emphasizing new questions and approaches that have emerged. I would like also to single out areas I believe to be particularly fruitful for future research. Again, thank you to Sheila Folliot for this slide. Since the publication of so many illuminating studies in the later 1990s and early 2000s, the study of art patronage and collecting by secular women in early modern Italy and in Europe more broadly has become an exceptionally vibrant field with an ever-growing body of literature in numerous languages. Today's when the study of female patrons was disparaged have clearly come to an end. Especially welcome is how recent research acknowledges the necessity of taking gender relations and reception into account. Due to time constraints, I can only mention a fraction of the important research that has been published in the past 20 years or so, a daunting task even for studies on Italy, still a major focus of work on women patrons, much less Europe more broadly and the Americas, where the topic of female donors in Viceregal New Spain is of much interest. Several chapters in Caroline Murphy's 2003 monograph on Lavinia Fontana concern women's patronage of the celebrated Bolognese painter. Murphy points out that these women prized Fontana for their ability to render their jewels, lavish dresses, and even, as you see at the right, their lapdogs. In 2003, selections from a large 1999 conference in New York titled Women Art Patrons and Collectors, Past and Present, organized by Lillian Zirpolo and Joanna Gardner-Huggett, were published in a special number of the journal Aurora. Several were devoted to early modern Europe, including Joseph Manca on Isabella d'Este's mother and role model, Eleonora d'Aragona. I should add that it was there that I met Dagmar Eichberger, whose work on Margaret of Austria has been so fundamental for us all. That same year, 2003, saw the publication of the seminal collection of essays, Architecture and the Politics of Gender in Early Modern Europe, edited by Helen Hills, which brought together several essays on women's patronage of architecture, both secular and sacred. Other scholarship on women and architecture in Italy specifically includes the work of Diane Ghirardo on Lucrezia Borgia as architectural patron and entrepreneur, in the Journal of the Society of Architectural Historians, and the Renaissance Quarterly in 2000 and 2008, respectively, and her 2009 book on the topic. Numerous studies by Catherine McIver on women in architecture include chapters of her 2006 book, Women, Art, and Architecture in Northern Italy, 1520 to 1580, Negotiating Power, and in essays published in 2012 and 2015, respectively, on women in domestic architecture in early modern Italy and in Cinquecento Rome. Two studies published by Kimberly Dennis in 2012 on Camilla Peretti, widowed sister of Pope Sixtus V, demonstrate how she was involved in several of her brother's projects. Like many women in Counter-Reformation Rome, Camilla combined familial and pious motivations in her patronage of architecture. Dennis has now turned her attention to the formidable figure of Don Olimpia Maialdachini Pamphili, seen at your right, and the construction of the Palazzo Pamphili in Piazza Navona in Rome. 2012 also saw the publication of Sally Hickson's Women, Art, and Architectural Patronage in Renaissance Mantua, Matrons, Mystics, and Monasteries. More recently, in the 2015 Bologna Festschrift, Brenda Pryor addressed the topic of gendered spaces in her wives' rooms in Florentine palazzi of the 15th and 16th century. Published in 2004, The Cultural World of Eleonora di Toledo, edited by Konrad Eisenbichler, brought together essays by a number of scholars addressing many facets of the Duchess's patronage, religiosity, and self-fashioning through art. More recently, Bruce Edelstein has published on Eleonora's patronage of the Boboli Gardens in Florence, and I'm absolutely thrilled to say that his book, Eleonora di Toledo and the Creation of the Boboli Gardens, and you see the cover here, will be published in April by the Uffizi. The patronage and agency of other Medici women, daughters, widows, wives, has been studied by Christina Strunk in her Die Frauen des Hauses Medici of 2012, and in the collection of essays she edited titled Medici Women as Cultural Mediators, 1533 to 1743, published that same year. In 2008, Stephanie Solem published a thought-provoking article in the Art Bulletin entitled Attributing Influence, the Problem of Female Patronage in 15th Century Florence, which problematized the study of female art patrons. The article was followed by her above-mentioned 2015 monographic study at your right. Like Crum and Ock in Beyond Isabella, Solem questions the very methods used to understand women's art patronage, especially the reliance on documentary evidence, the sine qua non of research on male patrons. For these scholars, issues of reception, stewardship, and viewership suggest new and especially promising paths for understanding the role played by gender in cultural production and consumption. Such concerns are fundamental to studies of Renaissance women, family, and material culture that address but also move beyond patronage, such as Murphy's The Pope's Daughter of 2004 on Felice della Rovere, daughter of Pope Julius II, Joyce DeVries's 2010 study of Caterina Sforza, McIver's contribution to the 2013 Ashgate Research Companion to Women and Gender in Early Modern Europe, which she co-edited with Alison Posca and Jane Couchman, her contribution titled Material Culture, Consumption, Collecting, and Domestic Goods, and Maria De Prano's Art, Patronage, Family, and Gender in Renaissance Florence, the Torno Buoni, which was published in 2018. In an article published just last year titled A Mother's Wise and Prudent Grief, Reading Raphael's Entombment Through the History of Emotions, Heather Graham elucidates the place of gendered expressions of mourning and grief in an altarpiece painted for the Perugian patron Atalanta Baglioni. Graham prioritizes, and I quote, the reception of the work, the way it likely communicated ideas about grief, gender, and decorous emotional comportment to its original audiences, end quote. Thinking about reception by women is an approach that has been invaluable for my own recent work on Raphael and gendered viewing, a small part of which has been published earlier this year in a German Festschrift. In important essays and in books, women's patronage of art and architecture at North Italian courts and convents has been studied by a number of scholars, among them Maureen Pelta, Mary Vaccaro, Catherine MacIver, Giancarlo Pariti, and Elisabetta Fadda. Especially interesting work has been done on the above-mentioned Giovanna da Piacenza and on Paola Gonzaga of Sabbioneta, young wife of the Count Galeazzo San Vitale, they're seen in the drawing at the left, who has been associated with a space in the Rocca di Fontanallato outside Parma, frescoed by Parmigianino, with the story of Diana and Actaeon. No documents exist to clarify the commission, and much ink has been spilled about whether Galeazzo or his wife acted as patron. Ultimately, it may be pointless to distinguish, as this could well be a case of cooperative conjugal patronage that should be thought of in an expansive sense that brings in not merely the payment for the works of art, but their use and their viewership. Along with other scholars, I think that the didactic inscriptions in the room, quoted above, were addressed to a female primary viewer, serving a function similar to admonitory domestic art like Cassoni and Spaliere. Thus, even if Paola Gonzaga did not commission the young Parmigianino in the narrow definition of the word, surely she had input and was central to the cycle's meaning. In the past decade, several important collections of essays on women patrons in early modern Italy, or that deal in part with the theme, have been published. These include, for example, Women Patrons and Collectors of 2012, edited by Susan Bracken, Andrea Galdi, and Adriana Turpin, which features an illuminating introduction by Sheila Folliott on women collectors in Europe, and one essay on an Italian topic, a study of Eleonora di Toledo by Galdi and Robert Lafrance. Wives, widows, mistresses, and nuns in early modern Italy, making the invisible visible through patronage and art, edited by Catherine MacIver, was also published in 2012, and the above-mentioned 2015 Festschrift by Carolyn Valloni, edited by MacIver and Stolhans, also deserves mention. In addition to case studies of individuals such as Lucrezia Borgia and portraiture by Alison Williams in the former, many of the essays in these collections concern broader topics, such as those on architecture, gendered spaces, and urbanism by Pryor and MacIver noted earlier. And here, of course, I cannot fail to mention the two very recent collections of essays edited by Noelia on Mary of Hungary and Juana of Austria as patrons and collectors, volumes that explore themes similar to those in the works on Italian topics I have been charting here. Finally, I should say that since the early 1990s, many doctoral dissertations have been written on women patrons in modern Italy and beyond. And a number of the books and articles I have mentioned here originated in dissertation research. I have been pleased to consult with some of the emerging scholars working on these topics, and I would like to single out the in-progress dissertation of Daisy Adams, a PhD candidate at the University of Texas, Austin, on female patronage of art and agency in 16th century Perugia. And I show you three altarpieces by Raphael that she is working on. In the conclusion to an article titled Beyond Isabella and Beyond, Secular Women Patrons of Art in Early Modern Europe, that was published in the 2013 Ashgate Companion to Women and Gender, I outlined some paths I saw at the time for future research on early modern women patrons. Among these was my hope that more work would be done on non-elite women as patrons, on women as patrons of architecture, both sacred and secular, including villas and gardens, and on women as collectors of antiquities and their role in assembling and displaying such objects. I also noted that, as suggested by the work of Caroline Murphy, the intersection of female artists and female patrons is a fascinating topic that could be fruitfully explored both in Italy and throughout Europe. I also noted that for Italy, the 17th century is replete with women patrons of all classes, ranging from humble prostitutes to exalted monarchs. But at that time, it was striking that relatively little work had been done in comparison to the previous few centuries. And in response to the calls of Crum, Ock, Solem, and others for a more expansive understanding of the patronage process itself, I encourage scholars working on women patrons to think more about audience, reception, and the use of objects. And finally, in all seriousness, I expressed a wish to see more men working on female patrons and collectors, and more men attending panels and conferences on women and gender. Many of the desiderata I expressed nearly a decade ago have been realized both in print and in works in progress. Here I would like to mention a few areas in which my hopes have been realized. In terms of social class, I would single out the work of Cynthia Stolhans on courtesans like Fiammetta in Rome, and on mistresses, including Vanozza de Catanei, who was the mother of Lucrezia Borgia, and on Giulia Farnese. We have also mentioned a number of works on women in architecture. And with regard to villas and gardens, as I noted earlier, I am especially pleased that Edelstein's book on Eleonora di Toledo and the Boboli Gardens will be published next month. I would also like to draw attention to the work of Mirka Benish, who is working on women and gendered experience in 17th century Roman gardens, like that of Princess Olympia Aldobrandini, and this is her recent article on that topic. Recent work that considers female patrons and collectors of women artists include Babette Bowen's 2020 Women Artists, Their Patrons and Their Publics in Early Modern Bologna, along with Adelina Modesti's 2019 book on Vittoria della Rovere and her contribution on Vittoria's support for women lace makers in last year's Women Artists in the Early Modern Courts of Europe, edited by Tanya L. Jones. Beyond Italy, the case of Sofonisba Anguissola at the Spanish court is especially interesting, and it's my pleasure to highlight Emma Louisa Cahill Moron's work on Catherine of Aragon and women artists. Especially intriguing is Consuelo Lollobrigida's proposal in her 2017 book on the Roman Baroque painter and architect, Plautilla Bricci, that the French Queen, Anne of Austria, may have been the artist's patron at the Church of San Luigi dei Francesi in Rome. I should also mention here Save Venice's exciting new project on early modern women artists in the Serenissima, led by Tracy Cooper, which it is hoped may find evidence for such intersection of female makers and female patrons viewers. And she is working in particular on pastel artists and lace makers. I think that this is a particularly rewarding avenue of research and certainly hope to see more connections established. A glance at the tables of contents of many of the recent publications I've mentioned in this talk still show a preponderance of women working on women, patrons, and collectors, and on gender more broadly, although that too is changing. And I cite here the fundamental work of Edelstein, Adrian Randolph, and Timothy McCall, whose book titled Brilliant Bodies, Fashioning Courtly Men in Early Renaissance Italy is quite literally hot off the presses, just published a couple of weeks ago. It goes without saying that the participation of several men in this symposium is most welcome. In conclusion, let me say that the 35 years since the mid-1980s, when conferences and publications began to appear, the study of women patrons and collectors has evolved from a tiny and marginalized area to an extraordinarily vibrant and exciting field in which scholars are engaged around the world. Over these decades, new questions and approaches, including the study of gender as opposed to only considering women, the application of reception theory, and thinking about viewership and usage, and more recently, global concerns, have all enriched this area of inquiry and have taken us far, far beyond Isabella. Thank you very much.